welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the first in a new panel series that we are launching in the School of Advertising and Public Relations. It is a series of panels called, as you can see, Ethical Theory times Practice. The goal of this series, and it was a series put together by a group of faculty. We sort of call ourselves the sort of faculty group on ethical thought leadership. It's a group of about 10 faculty within the School of Advertising and Public Relations. And the goal of this series is to present panels to you that bring UT faculty and alumni together as ethical thought leaders to sort of talk about issues and topics that are important to all of us. So the format of this panel, and we'll see how this goes today, and if it goes well, then we'll use this format going forward, is as follows. We're going to have three school researchers present very short presentations about their research, making it quite simple for us to just quickly hear about what it is that they research. And then we're going to have practitioners, students, and professors of practice respond to that research in a way where we can really bridge that theory, right? I should go like this, right? That theory with that practice in a way where we can make these really important connections between what we teach in the classroom and what we want to see happen in advertising and public relations practice. I do want to say very quickly that if you've never been to a webinar format, the way that this happens is you can see us, but we can't see you. And so the way that students can participate in this format is you can type at any time in the chat, and we would love to hear your comments or feedback at any time there. Or you can raise. I don't know if we can see you if you raise your hand. Although panelists, by the way, you can raise your hand or just speak. And students can ask questions, or attendees of any kind can ask questions in the Q&A, and we'll be monitoring the Q&A and the chat. And so it won't be an interruption if you enter anything into the chat or anything into the Q&A at any time. And so please, we want this to be interactive in that way. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to lead off with Kate Pounders. Kate Pounders is an associate professor in the School of Advertising and Public Relations, and she is going to present to us some of her work on gender and gender identity. And so Kate, if it's okay with you, I'm going to turn the proverbial mic over to you, and let's see what you'd like to tell us about.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Excellent.
And so everyone can see?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you just move this over here. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm really excited to be here and be part of this first series of panels. And so I'm really excited to share my research on you. And I just titled this talk, The Portrayal of Women and Beauty Norms in the Media. And so my research has focused, or one of the areas of research that I do, focuses how women are portrayed in the media in terms of physical appearance, and how this impacts how women feel about themselves. So really focusing on, I like to say that a lot of my work focuses on the unintended consequences of the imagery that we're exposed to. And so here you can see a bunch of different ads and imagery, and all of these ads, as you can see, feature very thin models, which are examples of the types of imagery that we are bombarded with in our society, and historically have been for decades now. And we're starting to see a change in that, which I can speak to later on in my presentation. But I really think it's important for all of us to really take a step back and think about how often we're exposed to this type of imagery and the norms that that creates in terms of beauty norms and expectations about how women are expected to look. And so my work has really focused on what I call the thin ideal in advertising. And that refers to women who are depicted, as you can see here, who are far below the average female body size and body weight. And so the thin ideal really stresses a level of slimness that is unattainable for most of us. and a really youthful body shape rather than the normative female body that most of us have, and how this impacts consumers. And so you can see here Victoria's Secrets, who I'm not particularly fond of, over the types of imagery that they've put forth for a number of years. And they're starting to change that, I think, because they've been forced to. But so basically, my research uses social comparison theory, and that's just, it's real simple. It's just basically the fact that we constantly compare ourselves to other people in order to evaluate ourselves on a variety of different traits. So this could be for students and participants, this could be, comparing yourself to your peers and the grades that you're getting. And so we're constantly comparing ourselves in order to evaluate the self. And so my research is focusing on social comparison in terms of physical appearance. And so whether we realize it or not, so sometimes we're very cognizant when we're comparing ourselves to other people, and other times we're not. And so this can be a conscious or, unconscious or subconscious process. And so what I have found through my work is that when women engage in social comparison to the images like you see here and you saw on the last slide, it really results in negative self-perceptions. And so basically, when people compare themselves, or women compare themselves with models that embody the thin ideal, like you see here, they feel bad about themselves. And so I have found that, exposure to this type of imagery can elicit feelings of shame, which then can turn and impact negatively our self-esteem, our body dissatisfaction. I've even measured intention to consider cosmetic surgery, unhealthy behaviors, whether that comes in the form of severe dieting or, bulimic behaviors. And so that's kind of a bulk in terms of looking at how this imagery impacts young women's self-perceptions. And most of this work is done in terms of looking at how this imagery impacts college-age women. I think it's also interesting, and my research has documented this, as have several other studies, that in the last decade or so, that there's an inverse relationship between between attitude toward the brand and attitude toward the self. And so it's really interesting to me that women generally actually have preferred the brands and the imagery that you see here, even though it makes them feel bad about themselves. And so the good news is my research is now suggesting that this is changing. And so you can see here, Ashley Graham, she's a quote unquote plus size model. I hate labels like plus size. I hate labels of all sorts, but she's, a plus size model. And so another study that I recently conducted in the process of writing up was a study that examines how women respond to photoshopped versus non-photoshopped imagery. And you can see here, Ashley Graham is not photoshopped here. And the results from that study show that young women, and again, college age, actually did prefer the non-photoshopped model compared to the photoshopped models. And I found that in two different product categories. So lingerie and also actually athletic running shoes. And so to me, that's a positive step in the right direction. And so to me, the results of that study show that we're starting to see a bit of a change in the type of imagery that young women want to see, which is a great thing. And I think this goes to our society's desire to see more body inclusivity, and perhaps also, this term authenticity has received a lot of attention in the marketing and advertising research. And I think that young women want to see more authentic imagery. And then finally, I did a study which is kind of outside my norm. And so this was published a few years ago. And so you can see, again, this was a photo of Ashley Graham, and she was one of 3 covers that Sports Illustrated put out. I think it was back in 2016. So again, it wasn't the central, she was just one of 3. And so Sports Illustrated puts out their annual swimsuit issue in March. And so I did a content analysis of this photo, and then also a photo of another quote unquote plus size model, Robin Lawley, who I think is a size 10 or a 12. So I don't really consider that plus. But what we did was we pulled thousands of comments from different news stories on social media promoting or kind of headlining these different plus size models being featured. And you can see here, These are the themes that we found and going through these thousands of comments. And so very positive response in terms of excitement and appreciation. And you can see here, this is just an illustrative quote. It's wonderful to see a model that looks like us all. And we also found a theme glorifying obesity. And this theme was actually very prevalent, and it surprised me. And the comments that we found in this theme were very hostile and a lot of anger. And so you can see here, yeah, let's show our children how wonderful it is to have heart disease, diabetes, all of these things, which of course we can't ascertain or make assumptions about a person's health just by looking at a picture. And I actually follow Ashley Graham on Instagram, and she's constantly working out. We had a theme, what is plus? Because like I said, you don't see a picture here of Robin Lawley, but if you look her up, she's maybe a size 10 or 12. And then again, a desire for real women. And you can see here, yeah, you're putting a real size woman on the cover, but they're photoshopping the hell out of her. And so kind of a desire for real women. And so I think I might be out of time. So that's kind of my presentation. I tried to keep it short and sweet, but that's just kind of some work I do in terms of how women are portrayed in terms of body shape and size, how that impacts how young women feel about themselves, and also looking at the type of imagery that is preferred. And again, I'm seeing a shift that I'm very thankful about in terms of the thin ideal, the photoshopped versus now seeing more of a preference towards a non-photoshopped.
Excellent. That was really helpful, Kate. And I think three themes that I want people to think about before we get to the responses, because we're going to go through all three research presentations, and then we'll talk about the implications of the work. Three things that I want people to be thinking about are this idea of labels, right? This came up in Kate's research. I also want people to be thinking about the idea of photoshopping. And so the idea of taking, what is real and then making it something not quite real as a theme. And then also the idea of authenticity, because I think this is also something that is really important in public relations and in messaging strategies. And so the three things I mentioned are labels, this idea of photoshopping or taking the real and then tweaking it a little bit and making it something not quite real, and then authenticity. Okay, so we're gonna, I do want to interject one thing. I have been monitoring the chat. We did hit a snafu with having the incorrect link, and we had to remove students. And it seems as though if we removed students from the panel, they may be blocked due to some protocols, perhaps of, them reading that as we removed people because they were, unsavory characters. So as a result, we are recording this event. And so students will be able to, Dr. Ciszek and any other professors who were collecting credit, for coming or attending this, we'll work out some other way for you to achieve that credit. This will be a recorded event, and so we'll find a way for students to earn that credit. So don't panic, everything is going to work out. And thanks for your patience on that. So next, we're going to hear from Dr. Ciszek, and she is going to talk to us about her research on identity. And this will be a great segue from Dr. Pounder's research. And let's hear what you have to say.
Sounds good. Great. All right. I'm going to share some slides here as well. All right. Can you see the slides?
Yep.
Okay. Hold up. Let's do some closed captioning here. Fantastic. Let me get my notes. All right, thank you, Leanne, Dr. Kaler, and Dr. Pounders for the introductions and for thinking about this and encouraging us to feature it in the class today. And thanks to the students who are joining us today. So the next 5 or so minutes, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit more philosophically. So I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to have you think about some things that I think about. And so the next 5 minutes, I'm really going to be focusing on deconstructing, rethinking, challenging binary ways of thinking. Okay. And so by definition, binary refers to a concept or concepts that are in opposition to one another, right? This notion of us versus them, or inside versus outside, this or that, right? And so I want you to pause for a moment. Since I only have 5 minutes, you can have 10 seconds or 20 seconds. And I want you to think of 2 or 3 binary concepts in your own life that come to mind, okay? So you might have some immediate ones that come to mind, right? When we think of binaries. Let me give you some ideas of what I've been thinking about recently. Okay, in this class, it's advertising and public relations. They're set up as binaries, okay, or maybe somehow exist in opposition to one another. Okay, corporate versus nonprofit, right? Activist versus organization, right? First world versus third world, male, female, white, black, hetero, homo, student, teacher, corporate, nonprofit, all of these binaristic ways of structuring the world, right? What I think about and what I encourage you to think about is the ways in which binaries are social constructs that that structure and frame power and an inequality in society, okay? And we use these binaries in whether we sort of consciously or subconsciously apply them in the messaging that as strategic and persuasive communicators often infiltrate our messaging, and it has real ramifications, okay? I argue in my work that binaries are unproductive and they're static, okay? As someone who's recently started exercising more and running, I've been thinking a lot about motion and things in motion, and this idea that as future practitioners, we need to be kinetic. We need to be in motion. We need to be rethinking the structures that govern the work that we do, okay? So we need both theory and practice that is kinetic, okay? Our contemporary landscape requires that we live and operate in ways that negotiate much more diverse and complex and therefore messy systems, okay? And so binaries for me are unproductive. All right, let me give you an example. I found this yesterday and I thought it was pretty fitting for thinking about ways we can challenge gender as binary concepts, okay? So let's get basic and let's get sort of personal here. In some of your classes or as practitioners, you're going to be asked to do some audience segmentation, right? And you might ask someone in a survey whether, you know, a series of questions, their age, their sex, their race, ethnicity, etc. But what if we blew up those concepts and looked at them more complexly, okay? I'll just give you my unicorn example here, but thinking about the ways that we can sort of expand upon a binaristic concept, right? So rather than asking someone if they identify as, you know, female or male, providing a much broader spectrum of responses and ideas, okay? All right. Oh no, it's a broken link over there. Okay. One thing I think a lot about in my research is the historical binary of activism and public relations. Okay. Historically, there have been tensions in these spaces. So while PR practice and theory have suggested maybe a animosity between public relations and activists, there's evidence that suggests that activists have been doing public relations for more than 100 years, okay? They've been using a lot of the same tactics that PR practitioners have been utilizing, motivated by many of the same drivers, okay? So going back and thinking through history, individuals and groups have been doing PR and social reform to eliminate slavery, to reduce the oppression of women and minorities, improving the health and well-being of people, et cetera. And sort of challenging the idea that public relations is something that only organizations and corporations do. When in reality, if you look back at various social movements, whether it's the abolition movement, the suffrage movement, labor organizing, the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, LGBTQ movements, they are lobbying to create change. They're creating alliances, they're raising money, they're mobilizing resources, they're engaged in media relations, community relations, and they're advocating for reform, right? So we're looking at this. So that binary of activist versus corporation, that's unproductive for advancing theory and thinking about theory. Okay, so my challenge to you is to deconstruct binaries and to rethink. Okay, the idea is that we need to rethink this very idea of identity, right? Rethinking where we get information, how we come to understand certain ideas and concepts and politics that inform public relations and advertising practice. Okay, so for us, it's about pushing those boundaries, pushing those binaries, and to acknowledge and understand the flow and connections between people and places. Okay, and how these connections have come and become increasingly integrated into our everyday lives. So this means, how do we take into account multiple stakeholders, okay, and their overlapping identities? We recognize, right, that we're complex human beings, and so my gender is implicated in my race, which is implicated in my social class and my education and my physical or cognitive abilities, all of those things, right? I am a intersectional person with multiple competing and conflicting identities. So we need theory and we need practice that accounts for those multiple perspectives, views, and lived experiences, okay? How much time do I have, Leanne?
I don't know. I'd wrap it up soon, just because you've thrown a lot of information at our tiny little brains.
All right, so I'll let your brain hurt and just say that in our fields, we need to complicate things that we have historically simplified. Okay, the simplification by way of, for example, audience segmentation, that's led to a commodification of individuals, of groups, and identities, right? And so what I'm saying is that we need to think more complexly and more in ways that we get our brains and our hands dirty to really account for the needs of humans. That's it. Mic drop.
Excellent. All right, so just to give you all something to think about as before we move into our third theoretician, I want you to be thinking in terms of social constructs. Okay, that was one of the things that she talked about. I want you to be thinking in terms of binaries and binary thinking. That was one of the other things that she sort of cautioned us about. And I also want you to be thinking about the coexistence of activism and PR. Okay, these are one of the things that these things coexist. And I think it's important for us to think about that that's a binary, right? And oftentimes the way in which these things are sort of presented to us, it is inside versus outside, or us versus them. And I think it's a creative way to think about it, to think that, and you didn't really mention this, Ciszek, but I think to think about them in terms of that they really need each other, and without one there wouldn't be the other, and that this coexistence really pushes us forward. But I'll leave that to, I just wanted to leave everyone with a quick summary to be thinking about before we move on to Mimi Drumwright. Dr. Drumwright, wow us with your research, which I have had the pleasure of learning about when you presented it to the Vice Provost for Gender and Equity about last month. So I'm really excited to hear a quick summary of it again, please.
Thank you. For you students, I hope that hearing a little bit about my research might broaden your understanding of the context in which you might work. For some time, my research is focused on how and why people make the ethical and unethical decisions that they do. Recently, my co-author, Peggy Cunningham of Dalhousie University in Canada, and I have been studying two related questions. How and why does unethical behavior persist in work organizations, often as an open secret? And how and why do some people give voice to their values and try to disrupt it? We started this research several months before the Me Too movement began, and it gave us many more potential research sites. We've conducted 60 in-depth interviews with people in the US and Canada and a variety of types of organizations in which unethical behavior has persisted: news organizations, businesses, government, healthcare, higher education, the military, nonprofits, and sports. We've examined a variety of types of unethical behavior, ranging from fraud to sexual harassment to discrimination to abuses of power. Two theories emerged from our data as particularly helpful in providing insights: behavioral ethics and social network theory. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the broad themes that we identified that cut across the types of organizations and the types of unethical behavior. A lot of research on unethical behavior focuses on the perpetrators, the bad apples. But we found that the key to understanding why unethical behavior persists involves understanding the social relationships surrounding the perpetrators, their social networks. We call these social networks networks of complicity because they support and protect perpetrators and enable them to continue their bad behavior. Common types of support involve fixing problems and rewarding people who comply with the network norms. For example, one quote, which is similar to what many people said to us in describing networks of complicity, went like this. Okay, so how many people around the perpetrator know that he is a sexual predator? Well, he's got to have his fixers, and he has to have the people who are doing the honeypot work. They all end up having to be burdened with the necessity of deceiving themselves and others as to who the perpetrator is and what he's doing. So the perpetrators are talented network builders. They draw people into their networks with rewards and benefits and sometimes with fear. They manipulate information really well, and they're particularly good at building myths about themselves and about their indispensability to the organization. So to be active enablers and protectors of the perpetrator, the members of the network of complicity have to deceive themselves. They have to have motivated moral blindness. So they don't see the ethical issues because it's not in their best interest to do so. And this blindness is supported by a host of rationalizations, like the self-interest bias, the obedience to authority bias, the in-group out-group bias, to name a few. The result is the network of complicity becomes entrenched, and it helps create and contribute to a toxic organizational culture. So also in this same organization, there typically is a network of complacency. And this is a loose confederation of bystanders who are passive enablers of the perpetrator in the network of complicity, who do nothing, and in so doing actually support the perpetrator. One person, again, representative of what many people said this: they're passive enablers in that they don't do anything directly. They almost don't want to know about the existence of the unethical behavior because it challenges them to do something. And so these people have a variety of rationalizations also, like the conformity bias. After all, nobody else is speaking up. So actually what we have here is a toxic triangle with a bad leader, susceptible followers, and a conducive context. But there are people who do try to disrupt this bad behavior, and we collectively call these networks, there are three of them, networks of empowerment. The first is the whisper network, and its purpose is to protect some potential victims with informal and covert warnings. One person, again, representative of many, said this: because I was worried about the perpetrator and his behavior, I started the whisper campaign. So it's, here's the guy who's the creep. Here's the guy you don't want to ever be alone with. If he starts doing this, beware. So the problem with the whisper network is that it doesn't activate to do more than warn others because of deficiencies in the network and because of various behavioral ethics biases, like the denial of responsibility. It's not my job to speak up, is the way that would go. But sometimes people in the whisper network activate to form a transactional network. And the purpose of the transactional network is to get rid of the perpetrator. And so the network undertakes formal transactions to try to make that happen. And typically a trusted and competent leader steps forward to proactively network, to create ties with other people, to share information, and to leverage the competencies of the network members. The problem is, even when this network succeeds and the perpetrator is removed, the network of complicity remains intact. And so even though the perpetrator is gone, the toxic culture remains and other bad behavior remains. What it really takes to change things is what we call a transformational network. And the purpose of the transformational network is not only to halt the unethical behavior, but also to transform organizational culture and societal norms. An example of this would be the Me Too movement. And these transformational networks are typically triggered by an external event that puts the issue on the public agenda. The network begins organically, but evolves into proactive networking. It expands across organizations, and oftentimes new organizations emerge, like Time's Up or Press Forward. And these typically need to evolve into a movement to bring about change, transformational change, which typically is long and slow. Now, I'd like to say a few things specific to the PR context. Whether deserved or not, PR professionals often are seen as part of the problem, as supporters of the network of complicity, and as using their expertise in communication to perpetuate the myths that protect the perpetrators. Some research suggests that it's easy for PR professionals to take the path of least resistance and be largely silent about ethical issues, part of the network of complacency. I think the good news is the research that Marlene Neal and I did on public relations professionals playing the role of organizational conscience, and I understand Dr. Ciszek assigned that to her students. That research demonstrates that public relations professionals can be forces for positive change in their organizations. In fact, they're in a unique position to do so because of their boundary spanning roles that give them the ability to network with key constituents and insights and understandings into the concerns of those constituents. However, to do so, they have to be skillful communicators, they have to be very effective networkers, and they have to be artful organizational politicians to be heard, to be effectively heard. And this is tricky because they must avoid the kill the messenger problem. However, the encouraging thing is that we did find that public relations professionals can and do play the role of organizational conscience, and they can be the people who lead in transactional and transformational networks.
That was great. Thank you, Mimi. As you were going through all these scenarios, I was thinking, God, I feel like I've lived through every single one of these. And I saw so many people nodding their heads on the panel here, like, yep, lived through that. Yep, seen that. God, I probably even participated in that unknowingly, unthinkingly. So just to summarize some of the terms I want everyone to be thinking about, this network of complicity. This is a really important concept I want everyone to be thinking about. Also, I think that the idea of susceptible followers, this idea also of, I would say even vulnerable followers, because one of the things that's not mentioned in this, but I think it goes without saying, is that there are power differentials that make it sometimes very difficult for people to stand up because of this concept that you mentioned, kill the messenger, which is to say that sometimes if somebody makes too big of a fuss, they'll just be let go. And so there has to be a way to negotiate being the messenger or being the one who stands up without ending up just being eliminated from the organization. So with that being said, we have heard from our three wonderful researchers, and I would like to now turn this over to our three respondents. And if it's okay with you, Lisa, I would love to lead off with you. We have, by the way, had some questions in the Q&A, and I see researchers, you've been kind of, you've been answering those as we go. I see, Kate, that you have one that you'd like to respond to verbally, it looks like. Take a look at those as we're going, but we'll take those at the end then. If that's okay with you. I just wanted to let you know I'm watching those. So Lisa, if you could lead us off responding to, and just so you guys know the format, you can respond to one, you can respond to all. We'll take this as a conversation, and let's just have fun with it, because I think there's some really cool connections that we can make here.
I will be glad to start. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I am so inspired, as always, by the work that our researchers do, and so thankful for this platform to share more of that with the world, because, we're talking about binaries. One of the big binaries, I think, on the table is on the slide right behind Leanne's head, theory and practice, right? So let's talk about that for just a second, in the sense that this research is fuel for the way this industry needs to continue forward. So this is not just about research and ideas, it's about what we do with it. And I think I'm just incredibly happy to say that we are seeing shifts in the direction of all three of your work. I think all three of you pointed that out, that this is inspired work because of the need for it, but also the evidence that there are movements happening in places all three of you guys addressed. So for example, I'm incredibly inspired by the work that CVS did over the last 2-3 years with their Untouched campaign in store and not allowing any kind of alteration in any of the products in their stores. I'm inspired by the way Good Morning America have used Jenna and Hoda as untouched news anchors in the morning to inspire, generations of hopefully many different women and individuals out there. I'm inspired by, folks like Billie Eilish who don't want, there to be judgment out there touching the lives of many young individuals out there. And then just to kind of point out that I think the industry is luckily kind of catching up with the need to really understand people, this transparency, this authenticity that we've talked about. For so long, it's been kind of lip service, but I think the industry is really catching up. The traditional way of drawing a box in targeting and putting people in boxes, and targeting is a necessary thing. Obviously, we all would agree that we need to have audiences that we're trying to attract and communicate with. But rather than drawing a box and putting people into that, I think brands are starting to understand to define the behaviors they'd like the folks in their community to embody, and then building targets around that connective tissue, right? So who are the people we want to be associated with as a brand? Who are our communities? What do they value? And then another point I want to make, besides just identifying the individuals in the community or in the targeted, whatever you want to call it, I think brands are also paying attention more to a point that Erica made about, I'm a multiple faceted individual, right? And so really thinking about me as a teacher, as a mom, talking to me then about being a supervisor or a colleague, a spouse, a girlfriend, a sister. I have these many different portions of my life that I embody at different times of the day, different times of the week, different times of the year. And so to have me recognized and seen for all of those things by a brand, I think brands are starting to really do that. So that's my 2 cents. I don't know if that's additive or not, but those are things that we talk about in my classes and we work towards.
Yeah, excellent. Does anyone want to respond to Lisa's response to the presentations you guys gave?
I mean,
I want it to free flow.
Yeah, I mean, I also talk about CVS and their dedication to, it was a couple of years ago now, for any of their cosmetic brands that they won't use retouching. And their hopes, because I read the statement when that came out, and I think it's been 2 to 3 years ago, was that they would hope other cosmetic companies like Revlon, L'Oreal will kind of follow suit. And I don't think that that's happened. But I do applaud that initiative. And I also, use that as an example in my class. So
excellent. All right, sweet. Danny, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, I think this is such a great discussion. It's really nice to see things come full circle. And on the body image thing, how great is it that we have Serena Williams,
Yes.
the #2 most paid female athlete and top 50, amongst the highest paid athletes that's getting paid. And I worked with her husband on a couple of campaigns, and
Nice.
he shared a lot of secrets about Serena. But I think the one thing that she really values is what is her brand, right? And she only works with brands that reflect who she is. And I think the days of the thin bodies, I think that's going away. I think brands are becoming smarter, right? We have so much at our disposal, like Lisa said, with data collection and audience and data mining, right? And so I think that conversation weaves really nicely into Dr. Ciszek's multidimensional aspect of individuals, right? And so from my standpoint, what I do with my team is, we collect so much information about individuals and we score them. I think it's the ranking and the scoring of individuals to say, hey, who has the highest propensity to purchase my product, right? And an individual could be qualified as different buckets, right? Based on your target groups. So it's not mutually exclusive. So I think depending on the positioning that you want to go into, it's how you cherry pick and select the binary composition, right? As well. So I think that those concepts are really, really cool. And then Dr. Drumwright, your whole piece was so inspiring to me because I think the workplace really does need a gut check for how we, not only create culture, but how do we maintain top talent and have a cohesive culture where everyone has an equal voice. It's flat and not a hierarchy. I think ensuring that there's not a power element to feedback is great. And I think that's how we become better, and that's how brands become better, and that's how connections between brand and advertising and PR become a lot more sophisticated. And it's really that level of transparency that brings the best work forward.
Danny, can I get you to talk more about the buckets? Like, give us an example.
Sure. So let's just use CVS since we're talking about CVS on a couple of topics. So if you think about CVS, they have the farmer, department, but they also have a beauty department, and then they have casual snacks, right? So Lisa Dobias could fall underneath my beauty category, but she could also be a sports nutritionist category, right? So if I am data mining for Lisa, right? Lisa is probably a multi-dimensional individual. So I wouldn't just put her into the beauty only category. I would also want to market to her as a sports enthusiast or a sports nutritionist as well.
Okay.
And it's all about, you look at not only demographic information, but to Lisa's point, there's so much behavioral information that we can collect on folks.
Okay.
Google and Facebook and all these platforms are always collecting information, even with voice, right? You talk to your friends about, gosh, I want to drive this BMW. And then the next thing you know is you go online and you see a BMW ad. So, I mean, there's voices and eyes everywhere. And so that data collection, I think, becomes really important to, how advertisers think about targeting. And I think there is a responsibility on the advertising side to ensure that that data is used in the best way, right? I would say if you put your best ethics forward, those are the methodologies and approach that typically produce the best sales, right? When you're trying to be sneaky and overuse data in the wrong way, you attract the wrong customers, right? And you attract the wrong followers. And what happens is then there's a negative, you might have a short-term gain, but the long-term gain is not positive.
I think also, so one of the things we talk about in the ad research class I teach is that, just because you can get all that data and you can fill all those buckets for Lisa, how the hell do you turn that into a concept, right? Okay, so she fills the beauty and nutrition but then turning that into something where it's visibly recognizable and hits her and pulls her in.
Well, I'm going to follow Lisa around and I'm going to see what she's reading on the New York Times. And, she's picking up a magazine from Condé Nast, is she reading the digital format of Vanity Fair or not? And then, with your mobile device, I'm also tracking where you're going. So there's a lot of stitching. I call it plumbing and stitching on the back end. Excellent. Where you can start to create these profiles of individuals. And then I'm also going to look at Lisa because she probably indexes against my top 1% of buyers, and look at my loyalty rewards program to see how frequent Lisa is shopping. And then I'm going to use different algorithms, whether it's a decision tree or random forest algorithm, to create more lookalikes of Lisa.
Excellent. These are the connections I needed you to make for the students. Perfect.
Wait, I have a question here because so I'm a troublemaker. And so a lot of the things, Danny, that you said were really triggering for me. And so I'm like, the algorithm wasn't written for me, right? And so, and I don't mean that for me. I mean, like,
Yeah.
when we're thinking about historically marginalized groups, which is a lot of the work I do, a lot of people tell me that algorithms were not meant to pick them up, or maybe facial recognition software doesn't work well with different forms of skin pigmentation, for example. So what happens when the writers of the algorithms or the algorithms themselves don't represent the complexities of society? And I think maybe that's just an open-ended rhetorical question, but if you have any response, any of the panelists, I just like to think about that, because that kind of troubles me.
Yeah. I can jump in real quick. That's a great question. What I do with my team is, instead of deploying a full segment based on the algorithm, what we do is we then segment the segments into propensities, right? Like the top 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%. And we look at the performance of each of the propensities and percentiles. What you'll learn is probably the top 1% of that percentile is performing the best, and maybe the top 2%, right? Typically, when you go further out to the 3 or 4 percentile, the algorithm signals are weakened, and so it's less reliant, right? So I think the responsible advertisers would go more granular and niche and have more of that stair-stepper approach versus, and Google's notorious for this, where they will create segmentation against their algorithms and say, hey, you have to target against all 12 million individuals. Whereas, we say, hey, we want to break up that 12 million individuals and actually just deploy the top 1%, 2%, 3% of that segment.
Mm-hmm. And plus, Erica, if you show us your T-shirt, right? So show us your T-shirt. Yeah. So that's in your profile, right? You purchased that T-shirt, and you've purchased other items like that. So you do fit some algorithm, right? And that stuff's being targeted to you on Facebook, and it's being kind of like the other day, I'm always sharing news stories with you, and you're like, why are you getting these? It's like, because they know me now, or they think they know me, and I'm always getting these now. And, so it's not flawless, but.
Can I add to that too, Leanne? So, and there's the human aspect, Erica. It's a great, there are triggers, and there should be, because data can't make decisions. Data is fuel for decisions, right? And data is people and their behaviors. Let's not forget that. So let's treat it with respect. But algorithms are flawed. I mean, let's go back 2 years again to 2018, where Amazon got into a really big problem, because for 4 years prior, they were using an algorithm to scan resumes and go through. And because of the coding of that algorithm, they found a hugely disproportionate amount of males hired for tech positions. Why? Because the way the algorithm was written, female behaviors don't necessarily track in that algorithm as strongly as male behaviors and word choices on resumes and patterns in resumes. And so 75% of the candidates for those tech positions from the very first scanning moment were male. So it put those, female applicants at a huge, disadvantage. So data left alone, pushing buttons, flipping levers, Danny can't do that, because that's not only not ethical, it's not smart, right? So.
And Lisa, you're so right. It's almost, if we think about, I hate to pull the election into this, but if you think about what Facebook and these social platforms were doing, right? From a brand safety perspective, they were relying on algorithms, right? But those itself will not pass ethics, right? So you do have like Facebook and even YouTube, they have different task force. They've hired for a lot more humans to actually scrub and review, content as well, because the algorithm itself won't scrub, 100% for all those filters.
I'd like to jump in and reemphasize a point that I thought Danny made very beautifully, and that's the importance of culture and the importance of an ethical culture in terms of attracting and retaining the best people. And there's certainly research that shows that people can do their best work and stay the longest in an organization if they feel like there is an ethical approach to leadership and an ethical culture that they feel good about working in.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. This is a great segue to Nicole.
Yeah, one of the things I'd emphasize is I work at Texas Instruments, and diversity and inclusion is very important for us. And so as a tech company, as a B2B tech company, you're probably not seeing a lot of our advertising. Most people think that we still make calculators. That's okay. Engineers know what we do. But at the same time, internally, what we focus on a lot is making sure that we're bringing out diverse perspectives. So there's a lot of conversation about algorithms not being perfect. And that's because largely, in some ways, you don't have diverse perspectives around the table actually informing whether or not they're taking into account different life situations. And so one of the coolest things that I find is that we have these different layers of diversity and inclusion within TI. We actually just started one within communications and marketing to have difficult conversations, to be able to bring that out into other parts of the organization. You have actually a group of what we call diversity initiatives as well, which represent all kinds of identities, and we encourage people to join each other so they can learn from one another, as well as there's actually a diversity and inclusion office. But a lot of the work happens at those different layers, so that way you're not just having a conversation when it comes to the whole company level or seeing it in our social media, but we're trying to get people to talk to each other so that way they think about grabbing different perspectives to bring to the table when they're trying to solve a problem. It's not perfect at all. There's a lot that needs to be done, and I'm excited to see it go deeper, but it has been one of the really cool things to see evolve over at TI since the time I've been there.
I would like to kind of jump on that, like kind of a side comment. I feel like embracing diversity kind of means we have to redefine what it means within all existing organizations at the moment. And kind of like how Nicole mentioned, it's an essential element for innovation and representation. So in order for us, or not just us, but like in order for current PR and ad agencies to progress, they need to start kind of going over what their corporate standards are or their rules so that good things can happen along the way.
And let me just mention that Clarissa is a student in our school, and she leads the Public Relations Student Society of America chapter. And so thank you for speaking up.
Absolutely, thank you.
So Nicole, I also wanted to, you're not done yet. I also noticed that you were nodding your head a lot throughout Mimi's presentation. And so I wanted to get more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like everything that you said is basically our day-to-day. So my team is responsible for issues management and public relations. So this was something that I was not aware existed when I was studying advertising. But basically what we do is we consult with our business groups, with our legal teams, environmental safety and health, and we talk about things that could potentially be public relations issues. But what excites me more is that we go back and we try to work with the business to fix it. So we're not just writing messaging. A lot of times they think that, you know, we come to the table so that way we can type up a holding statement or to come up with a press release. And that's not at all what we do. We're there to challenge the perspective that they have and be able to then say, hey, what if you thought about doing this differently? Or, hey, this is going to cost the business some money, but actually if you did it that way, we wouldn't have to communicate anything at all. So it's really exciting because it's an opportunity to, first of all, make sure that communications is at the table. And I would definitely say if anyone is thinking about working client side, there's a lot of opportunity there, but make sure that you are at an organization where you're not just writing messaging, but you're actually contributing to business strategy. And then also really to see how deeply that goes within the organization. So that diversity and inclusion work that I talked about, I lead that team within our communications organization. So I think about the thing that could potentially impact our brand at all those different levels. But at the same time, I'd much rather go deep with employees and talk about those things before they ever become a problem. So that way we don't end up having a public facing issue. And when we do have a public facing issue, then we address it internally. So we actually a couple of years ago had a CEO change. And it's something that you can go out and look up, and our team was involved in the messaging for that. But then we've since had a lot of conversations about our values and our ambitions, and really taken that as an opportunity to strengthen those things within our teams. So that way we don't have to have conversations like that again outside of TI. So as much as I like to say, a lot of the work that we do never sees the light of day. That's the fun part, is to be able to really kind of go deep and dive deep into those things.
Yeah.
That's very inspiring. The question I wanted to ask you is, how did you get those engineers at Texas Instruments to have this broader conception of PR, as they should, as problem solving and as people who are helping them deal with these really important and pressing issues of society?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's one step at a time. So you were talking about networking and having that kind of deep network that doesn't get you shut out of the conversation. But a lot of the times it's our marketers pulling us in and saying, hey, we have a potential issue here. And then we come in and talk to them and ask a lot of questions. So I never really come in with an accusatory tone. I'm always just asking them, hey, what would you think if you were reading this in the press? Or you know, how would you break this down if you had to? Is there any other way that we could do this? And have them come to the conclusion themselves. I think one of the biggest wins that I had a couple of years ago was we had someone in one of our businesses walking through a potential issue, and he was the marketing manager, and he was saying, oh, my team is going to be the one that hurts if this goes wrong. I'm going to be the one who has to go explain this to a customer. All right, so let's do this differently. And I love when we work ourselves out of a job, because eventually they think like us and they don't need to bring us to the table. I mean, we had a whole team where we used to review all of the safety related messaging, and that has since been kind of pushed into the business because they can just think that way themselves. And so that's the coolest thing, because there are not ever less issues to go get. We can always go find more of them. But as you talk to different folks, they get that expertise, and you're really kind of teaching more than you are doing in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent. I want to ask one question of you, Nicole, for our students. You talked about client side, and I think sometimes our PR students struggle with that question, and I bet you did when you were a student as well. And so could you sort of just walk us through quickly that decision-making process?
Yeah, so I actually had an internship in advertising while I was in school. I was there for about 1.5 years, and I was in an agency, and I really liked it. But I think the difference for what I was looking for was to be able to go really deep in one topic, as opposed to being in a variety of different topics. And I've talked to a few of my friends who are still in the field in that way, and they have that experience too. So kind of some of the things where I talked about of being able to go and say, hey, let's go to this business manager, let's go to this vice president, let's fix the problem there, versus being able to say, maybe you're doing that to a certain degree, but at a variety of different clients and different industries. That's really the difference there.
Yeah, really apples and oranges.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, excellent. So there was a question.
Wait. Speaking of fruit, there was a question here. I just wanted to say, speaking of fruit, there was a Can I ask this question? Because
an unfruit related question?
No, it is fruit related, because we're talking about non-binary and like queerness, right? So there was a proper segue to the fruitiness, but I don't want to take this question because I don't have the answer. But I think Danny or maybe Nicole, you might have perspective here, or also Lisa, in terms of how do the algorithms, this is from one of my students, I believe, how do the algorithms make sense of concepts, terms, identities such as non-binary? And I shared that in the chat here, but are you guys able to shine any insight on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, especially when it comes to LGBTQ+, there's not a box that you check to say that you're a queer person, right? So from an advertising perspective, a lot of it's contextual and behavioral. So it's, you know, what are the content that you're consuming? Who are you following? What signals are you exhibiting within your behaviors that gives the higher propensity that you fall underneath, you know, under this one bucket?
I can add a little bit to this based on my research in terms of practitioners who are thinking about this. I think one thing it's important for us to note that while terms like non-binary might be really prevalent or mean something to a certain generation of folks, the language also doesn't, it's generational too. So based on, I can share some market research data that language doesn't really translate to the boomer generation, for example, right? That there's still very clear delineations if you're talking about LGBTQ, like gay, lesbian, and like, but gender's really binary and overarching sort of trends for sort of boomers and older. So, you know, when you're thinking about the deconstruction of categories like pansexual or non-binary, right, those have to be contextualized within particular other demographic and behavioral categories, I think.
Yeah, and it's, you know, technology and data collection can do a lot, but it can't do everything. And that's why I think the multidimensional aspect of the binary concept that you talked about is important. And then you just have to basically, based on what the product that you're trying to sell or message that you're trying to convey, I think that's where the scoring and ranking, what are the more important attributes that you're trying to target, right? So maybe the binary aspect isn't as important, and maybe the your purchase behavior of the past, you know, week is more important to hone in on.
So there was another Q&A question, Kate, the one that you were gonna take live.
Yeah, I didn't actually mean to say I needed to take it live, but I'm happy to do that. And I think it was just, do you think that social media plays a role in labels for women? And absolutely. And I think in both a negative and a positive way. I mean, someone mentioned Billie Eilish, and so there's a host of positive influencers and body and physical appearance. But then you have folks that are still embodying the very thin ideal that's unattainable and unhealthy for women. But I do think that, you know, the pictures I showed, and I actually meant to touch on that, were, you know, very traditional print type media, and that's not what we're exposed to anymore. And so absolutely the imagery that we're exposed to on Instagram and other outlets is absolutely playing a role and will continue to play a role. And I see the potential for that to be more positive than negative, although you can talk about both the benefits and detriments of that imagery.
Yeah, and they've got a weird, I mean, it's almost like you could do away with some of those catalog bodies and start moving more towards the Kardashian bodies that we're seeing now on social media and Instagram, and it's a different body structure altogether.
Yeah, and I do think we are, like I said, moving in a much more positive direction. And so I think the whole with influencers,
positives, one word you could use, I guess, but
I do still think, and when I teach this in my ethics class, I think I have some of my folks in my ethics class here, you do see a change, which is a good thing, but predominantly we are still exposed to, if you even think about Netflix, I mean, just media largely speaking, we're still being exposed to, and it's sad to me when a headline like, oh, so-and-so did a plus size model. Well,
yeah.
You know, that why is that? So I still think that even though we're seeing a shift, it's a slow shift. And I didn't even get a chance to go into the, you know, lack of diversity in terms of race and ethnicity and age and all of these things, because
and weird appropriation of body parts. Dave gave a shout out to Lizzo, and Nicole, you've got your hand up. Oh, you're muted.
On your research, I actually had a question for you. So one of the things we've seen with companies like ours working from home for long periods of time is when people finally come back on the video, they've completely changed their appearance. I mean, we have, you know, some women who have gone gray, men who have completely grown out beards. They look completely different. And so I know your research is, you know, focused a little bit on maybe folks that are college age, but I'm curious as to maybe why that is, or what dynamic the pandemic is also playing with some of this, because I think that given the opportunity, like they were, people would look differently, but in the workplace too, they're deciding to change their perspective and what they look like.
It's pretty interesting.
It is interesting. And so Dr. Kaler and Dr. Ciszek and I were, I think, texting back and forth about this kind of issue the other day. And so there's a phenomena, and I'm forgetting the name, and I saw it actually on the Today Show but some women they're looking at themselves all day on Zoom and they're not liking what they look like. And so they're more likely to engage in cosmetic procedures or alter their appearance. And so you have that
syndrome.
Syndrome. And to answer your question about why I typically use college age students, it's because I feel like by the time that we reach a certain age, we're more aware of our limitations in terms of our ability to lose weight or alter our body. When it comes to late 20s or early 30s, a little bit more so. And so maybe we're not as impacted. I think we're still impacted, clearly. But I think that, and I would say that even I don't have access to high school girls in my prior research. But I think even, talking about middle school and high school age, those are probably the age groups that are particularly vulnerable to the imagery that are shown in media.
As an anecdote, I encountered my 7-year-old tweezing her eyebrows. And so I had a moment of self-realization, and I was unprepared for that. I'll just leave that anecdote, but I also want to drop another sort of rhetorical question, because I think we've talked a lot about and attended a lot to, and rightfully so, femininity and beauty, but the unsort of spoken spaces, I think for me, have to do with boys, men, and masculinity. And as someone who has a boy child as well, and 50% of or however many percent of our students identify as male. So I also want to trouble that, because I think the time has come for that. And I think there's a desire for that. There's been a ton of women's empowerment stuff, which is great. We still need that, and it's wonderful, but let's start breaking down some of the toxic masculinity, because that's the sort of impetus for this panel, was some of the political stuff that was the result of white supremacist toxic masculinity, right, Leanne? That sort of brought to the conversation around ethics and theory. And so for me, I don't know. I want to talk about that in the future, but plant seeds today.
Oh, absolutely. Maybe. Yeah. And you even anecdotally, I have 2 boys, and they talk more about their bodies than my daughters. Far more, way more.
Yeah.
They talk way more about their bodies.
Well, it's interesting too, and I didn't have time to talk about this in my research talk, but there's actually been very, very little work done on the impact that media has on men, whether it's body image or, it's just very, very little work has been done. And so I'm actually segueing into understanding how masculinity and the imagery that men are exposed to, and if that has an effect or not.
Danny's like, man here. Man with the hand up.
Fun fact. So you'll love this, Professor Catherine. My senior advertising thesis with Gary Wilcox was titled The Ken doll Syndrome. And it was really around the gay community and why gay men aspire to have the 6-pack abs, with the blue eyes and blonde hair. So much of your research, but probably not to the degree of sophistication and insights that you have.
I'd love to read that.
I got to dig it up somewhere. It's not, there's only a hard copy. I don't think there's a soft copy anywhere.
It will be at PCL, I assure you.
Yeah.
Are eating disorders up among young men as well?
Yeah. And I think athletes too. But I love what Dr. Ciszek was saying. I think, there is a big responsibility. I'm sure, Nicole, you'll agree with this, is brands have, a responsibility to have equal representation with who represents their brand. I run BMW North America at Universal McCann. And the one thing that we're super proud of is, if you look at our advertising, since 2017, we have turned the machine into humans, right? Doing things by partnering with New York Fashion Week, but selecting models and designers of color and of different sizes and shapes. And then, having an active voice that's authentic during Pride every year. And just I think being authentic is so important. You can't just do it and check the box. You have to do it and walk the talk, right? And I think this pandemic has really opened up so many opportunities for brands to really show who they are, not only from a messaging standpoint, but from a diversity and equity perspective as well.
Yeah.
I have a question towards Professor Pounders. So I was wondering, was any research done regarding your targets' views on brands that do promote body positivity or embrace all body types, such as the Aerie brand? I know they've been very vocal and they champion body positivity through their ads and flyers and all that stuff. So I was wondering, what are their views on that?
I have not done like an exploratory study to see. I mean, I talk about it in class and I talk about Aerie, and I mean, that was the impetus for using kind of the lingerie or undergarments product category for the first study that I did, looking at Photoshop versus non-Photoshopped, because I think there's ModCloth and a couple of other companies or brands who are embracing this kind of in that product category space. But I have not, I mean, I always talk about Aerie. I always talk against Victoria's Secret, even though I think they've now tried to, I think it's too little too late for them. But
almost, since they got called for that.
Well, and I think that it was either their CEO or their CMO said that, you know, their products were not for plus size people years ago. And so they've been in financial trouble for years. And so I do think there's a lot of backlash. And someone had made a comment, you know, about the Kardashians, and yes, but a lot of people can't also attain that body type. It's a different body type, which is great. But I mean, not everyone can attain that body type either. And it's also something that comes up during class or other presentations that I've given. And the kind of flip side is we don't want to skinny shame people either. I mean, and so, you know, my viewpoint is we want to, or we should see all body shapes and sizes, you know, and so I'm not saying, you know, oh, it's horrible, but when you're just predominantly over years seeing these very thin images, that does take a toll in terms of the expectations and beauty norms. And so,
all right, I have to be the lame-o, and I have to wrap this up, but this has been just so wonderful. I'm so glad we're doing this, and obviously we made the right choice. We're going to do this again, and thank you so much to our respondents today, and thank you to our researchers. And you all did such a wonderful job. Yes, this has just been so amazing. And thank you to our students. And just really a great experience. I feel like I learned a ton, and I thought a lot, and I made a lot of great connections, and I'm just really pumped. And we're going to do this again. Audience, please stay tuned for more panels. I promise they will be, we will try to top this. I don't know if we can, but we will try. So thank you so much. It's been great, and we'll see you all soon.